Cynthia Adeyemi had heard the word no delivered in every register a hospital board could manage. Sympathetic, no. Procedural, no. The no that came wrapped in a letter, thanking her for 11 years of service. Today's no had taken 4 minutes. They hadn't even asked her to sit down. She stood outside under an awning that wasn't wide enough, watching Seoul do what Seoul did in late October: flood the gutters, blur the neon, wash the whole city down to a rumor of itself. Her umbrella had died in March. She hadn't replaced it. Some part of her had decided that if she kept living like the appeal might still work, it would jinx the thing. It hadn't worked. She was 3 blocks from the subway when the small hand closed around the hem of her coat. Cynthia looked down, expecting an apology already forming on some parent's mouth. There was no parent. There was a girl, 7 years old, black hair soaked flat to her skull, and a boy beside her, who was not holding the coat, but was holding the girl's other hand, like the two of them were the last unbroken link in something. The girl did not look up. She did not ask for anything. She simply gripped the fabric the way a person grips a railing on a boat that's already listing. "Hey," Cynthia said, crouching. "Hey, sweetheart. Where's—" A woman in a foundation-branded raincoat arrived at a jog, already mid-apology in 2 languages, already reaching. "I'm so sorry. They slip out during transfer. It happens. Please." Careful hands worked the girl's fingers loose one at a time, the way you'd diffuse something. The boy went easily. The girl did not, and for 1 second, before she let go, Cynthia caught the wristband before the woman turned the girl away. Habit. 11 years of habit that hadn't been beaten out of her yet, no matter how hard the board had tried. The band read an intake date. She knew that date. She had spent 4 months reading intake dates for a living, cross-referencing them against admission logs until the numbers swam. And this one was wrong, in a way that didn't look like a smudge or a clerical slip. It looked deliberate. 4 days off from what the posted admission log inside the annex's lobby glass would say, if she'd thought to check it, which she now very much intended to do. "Ma'am, you can't be out here without," the staff woman started. "I'm not staff," Cynthia said. "Not anymore, but I used to be good at this." "Who filed that intake?" The woman's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "I really can't discuss patient records." She had the children through the annex doors before Cynthia finished the sentence she was building. Cynthia stood in the rain a while longer, coat wet through, watching a set of glass doors that had already closed. She told herself to go home. She told herself this wasn't her fight, that she didn't have a license to protect anymore, that the last time her instincts told her a number was wrong, it had cost her everything. She told herself all of that, and then she went home and pulled up every public filing the CO Foundation had ever been required to post. It took her 40 minutes to find the annex's roster. It took her 4 more to find the girl's name listed twice, under 2 different dates, 4 days apart, filed under 2 different case numbers, both signed by the same hand that had signed the chart that ended her career. The annex needed hands more than it needed a license, and Cynthia was careful to arrive exactly at the seam of that arithmetic. Temporary, nights only, no medication authority. She signed the intake form under a title that undersold everything she knew how to do, and nobody in the building thought to ask why a fired auditor wanted the job. She told herself it was about the wristband. It was, mostly. The corridor at 3 in the morning belonged to no one. Fluorescent light hummed down over waxed linoleum, and somewhere past the nurse's station, a monitor beeped on a rhythm nobody was listening to. Cynthia came around the corner with a supply cart and found a man sitting on the floor outside room 214, back against the wall, suit jacket folded beside him like he'd taken it off out of some private courtesy to no one. She knew who he was before he looked up. Yon did not have the face of a man who sat on floors. He had the face that was on donor plaques and hospital wings. He didn't get up. "You're new," he said. Like that explained the cart. Temporary. She didn't move to help him up either. Is there a reason the head of the foundation is sitting outside a supply closet at 3 a.m., or should I not ask? It's not a supply closet. I noticed the door had a nameplate. I also noticed you haven't gone through it. She let that sit. How long? He looked at the door instead of at her. Donor obligations. Sometimes it's easier to review things from out here. You're lying, Cynthia said, without heat, the way she'd once told a hospital board a chart was falsified. Flatly, because the alternative was worse. I spent 11 years reading people who lie for a living. You're not good at it. You're good at almost everything else, I'd guess, but not that. Something in his jaw shifted, not quite a flinch. He didn't order her removed. He didn't call security, didn't reach for the practiced authority that would have ended the conversation in 4 seconds. He just sat there and let her be right. How long? She said again. 2 years, he said. I come every week. I have never gone inside. She should have left it there. She had a cart to push, and a shift to finish, and no professional standing left to spend on a stranger's grief. Just sat down on the floor across from him, coat still on, and waited, because waiting was the only thing she had a license for anymore. He didn't tell her anything else that night, but he didn't tell her to go, either. The paperwork kept its own schedule, indifferent to whatever was happening in that hallway. Cynthia worked the annex's public filings against the terminated chart she'd kept a copy of out of pure spite, and the same signature kept surfacing in places it shouldn't. It was on the twins' second intake record. It was on the chart she'd refused to approve, the one that got her fired for refusing. Zangan, and when she finally forced herself to pull the one document she'd spent 6 years not looking at, her own discharge summary, the one that explained in careful, bloodless language why she would never carry a child. The signature was there too. She sat with that for a long time before she let herself feel anything about it. 3 different women's worst days, and one hand moving through all of them like it owned the ink. She didn't tell Do-hyun that part yet. She wasn't sure yet what she was building, only that it had a shape now, and the shape had his family's name on the letterhead. What she did find, buried in a transfer ledger she wasn't supposed to have annex-wide access to, stopped her mid-breath at the nurse's station, with the whole floor asleep around her. The twins' original file, the real one, the one that predated the falsified second copy, listed a mother, Seo Yuna. Cynthia didn't know the name yet. She only knew, from the way the file had been buried under 2 other names and a wrong date, that whoever Yuna was, someone had worked very hard to make sure nobody found her. The file also listed a death date, 9 years old, 3 years before the twins' first recorded intake. She didn't ambush him. She'd learned enough about him in one hallway to know that ambush would only give him a door to close. So she asked the floor supervisor for his office hours, and she waited in the corridor outside like any other visitor, and when his assistant tried to turn her away, she said only, "Tell him it's about room 214, and sat down to wait. He saw her in 9 minutes. His office was the kind of room built to make people feel smaller. High windows, dark wood, a skyline behind glass, and she set both files on his desk without sitting down first, because sitting first would have made it his room instead of a negotiation. I found 2 intake dates for the same child, she said. 4 days apart. Same signature that ended my career 6 years ago. And a mother listed in a buried transfer ledger, dead 9 years, 3 years before either intake. He looked at the files a long time before he touched them. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a denial. It was quieter than that. Her name was Seo Yuna, he said. Sheen, my sister. Cynthia sat down then, not because he'd offered, because the room had changed shape. There was a fire, he said. 9 years ago. She was in it. So were her 2 children. I identified what they found. I buried 3 coffins with my own hands because I didn't trust anyone else to carry them. He said it the way a man reads a verdict aloud, flat, because flat was the only way to get through it twice. I built this annex because I couldn't build anything else out of that year. And 2 years ago, 2 years ago, someone transferred 2 children into my own foundation's care. Anonymous. No paperwork that made sense. I looked at them for 11 seconds and I couldn't breathe. He said it without embarrassment, which told her more than the sentence did. I ordered DNA testing. It came back inconclusive. Once. Twice. His jaw worked. Both times, processed in-house. She let that sentence do what it needed to do to the room before she answered it. Inconclusive doesn't happen twice by accident. Not with siblings this close in age. Not with a lab that has the resources yours does. Somebody ran interference. I told myself grief was making me see a resemblance that wasn't there. Shoot! She kept her voice level, because the alternative was to let 2 years of his restraint collapse into something neither of them could use. I think somebody in your own compliance chain has been managing this for you since before you knew there was anything to manage. He was quiet long enough that she understood the quiet was the whole answer. Why? He said finally. Are you telling me this? You don't work for me. You don't work at all, by your own account. Because I have spent 11 months being told my judgment can't be trusted, she said, and I would like it back. That's my price. Shut! Not your money, not your protection. I want the chart that ended my career pulled and refiled with the truth on it, what the surgeon actually did, filed where a licensing board can read it and reinstate me on the facts. That's all. That's everything. She held his eyes. I'm not doing this for the children, Mr. CO. Yay. I'm doing this because the same hand that's been lying to you has been lying about me for 6 years, and I intend to stop that hand before it signs anything else. He agreed before she'd finished the sentence, which told her he understood exactly what it might cost him and had decided to spend it anyway. She didn't wait for the Foundation's lab. She drew the twins' blood herself 2 nights later, on shift, in a supply room with the door locked, hands steady in a way they hadn't been in 11 months, and she sealed the samples and routed them to a private lab across the city that owed nobody in this building anything. She told no one in the annex what she'd done. She told Do-hyun only that it was done, and that the results would come back to her, not to his lab, not to anyone with a signature she didn't trust yet. The next morning, the night log at the nurse's station showed an entry she hadn't made. Someone had accessed room 214 at 4:12 a.m. It wasn't her. When she asked Do-hyun if it had been him, he said no, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked afraid of something that wasn't grief. The termination notice was waiting for her at the start of her shift, printed and signed and dated with a precision that told her someone had been drafting it for days. Medication handling violation. A time, a room, a substance she'd never touched, documented with the kind of internal consistency that only exists when a story has been built, rather than discovered. Director Nam delivered it herself. She was sympathetic about it in the specific way people are sympathetic when they've already won. I know this must feel unfair, she said, and meant, Cynthia understood, every syllable of it as a closing statement. Cynthia took the paper, folded it once, and said nothing that would give the moment away as anything other than what it looked like, a woman losing. She went to find Do-hyun instead of going home, and found him already in motion, which frightened her more than the termination had. He had a man in a private room on the annex's 3rd floor. Dr. Han, Korean, 60s, the Foundation's former medical director. The man Do-hyun had decided, with total conviction, was the hand behind 6 years of falsified charts. 2 of Do-hyun's people stood at the door in the particular stillness of men who had been told not to write anything down. Cynthia stopped in the doorway before she'd fully decided to. Do-hyun. He didn't look at her. This ends today. Not like this. She kept her voice level, because raising it would have made this about his temper instead of his math. The moment you touch him, every document I've built becomes the product of a beating. None of it survives a family court. None of it survives an appeal. You will have gotten your hands dirty for nothing, and I will still be unlicensed, and those children will still belong on paper to whoever forged that ledger. He turned, finally, and what was on his face wasn't anger at her. It was the specific fury of a man being handed the one argument he couldn't outpower. 2 years, he said, low. 2 years I sat outside that door, instead of finding this out. Then give me 1 more day, instead of your hands. She held his eyes until something in his shoulders gave. 1/2 inch. Enough. Let them think they've already won. That's the only way Nam corrects herself in front of witnesses. He stood his men down in front of the very people he'd assembled to watch him not need to. She understood, watching it happen, that something in his authority had just broken that would not knit back exactly the way it had been. He didn't say so. He didn't have to. The board review had been convened, ostensibly, to formalize her termination, a courtesy hearing, a box to check before the paperwork closed. Cynthia asked to speak, and they let her, because letting her felt like generosity to people who had already decided the outcome. She read the twins' intake record aloud, calm, unhurried, exactly as she'd built it, and cited the case number wrong. Off by 2 digits, deliberate, buried inside a sentence dense enough that only someone who already knew the real number would catch the error at all. Director Nam caught it. "That's incorrect," Nam said, before she could stop herself, already reaching to correct the room's understanding, the way she'd corrected 100 small errors in 100 small meetings before this one. "The case number is," and she said it, "the real one, the number from the sealed transfer ledger. The number that existed nowhere a compliance chief should have had cause to memorize, let alone recite from nothing, in a room where the record was being kept. The room went very quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something has just become undeniable. Cynthia didn't smile. She wrote the correction into the minutes herself, in her own hand, because she wanted her name on the page that caught it. She was in the stairwell when the private lab's results came through on her phone, the recess bell for the review still humming somewhere behind her. She opened the email standing between 2 flights, and read it once, and then had to read it again because the first pass hadn't let it land. Do-hyun found her there a minute later. He didn't ask what it said. He didn't have to. Her face had already told him before her mouth caught up to it. The lab result said what her face had already told him in the stairwell. The twins were Yunars, not a resemblance, not grief manufacturing a hope out of 2 children's faces. Blood, confirmed twice now, by a lab with no reason to lie to either of them. What came after wasn't vindication so much as excavation. The fire 9 years ago had killed 1 infant. The 2 who survived had been moved through the same clean channel the Seo family's old money had built 2 generations back to launder worse things than grief, sold quietly, and then, in a stroke that Cynthia still couldn't decide was arrogance or carelessness, laundered back into the very foundation built in their mother's name. Director Nam had spent 9 years managing the paperwork of a dead woman's children moving through her own employer's care, 1 falsified date at a time, protecting a machine that had never once asked her to protect a person. The reckoning didn't look like the private room Do-hyun had almost given himself over to. It looked like filings, a revoked license, investigators in the Annex's records office for 6 days straight, an arrest that happened off-page, in a hallway, while Do-hyun stood a few feet away with his hands loose at his sides and let it happen without him. He lost the board. He lost half the foundation's standing, and the donors who'd built careers on being seen beside it. He lost, more quietly, the version of himself that had believed a man in his position could still solve things with his own 2 hands, if the provocation was large enough. Cynthia watched that go, and didn't tell him it was a fair trade, because she wasn't sure yet that it was. Her own chart was refiled within the week. The falsified record pulled, the surgeon's actual conduct written where a licensing board could read it in plain language. The reinstatement letter came 11 months after the appeal that had ended in 4 minutes, and it used careful, official phrasing to admit she had been right the entire time. She read it standing in her kitchen, alone, and felt exactly 2 things at once. Relief, because her name was clean again. nothing shaped like joy, because the letter corrected a record and could not correct a body. She would practice again. She would never carry a child. Both of those were true, and the paper on the counter didn't ask them to cancel each other out, and neither, finally, did she. The guardianship hearing came 3 weeks later. Do-hyun couldn't petition alone. The scandal still clinging to the foundation's name made him, on paper, an unfit sole guardian, whatever the truth of his blood tie. The filing went in with 2 names on it instead of 1. Afterward, in the corridor outside the courtroom, the girl found her the same way she had the first time. No announcement, no asking, just a small fist closing around the hem of Cynthia's coat and refusing to explain itself. Cynthia didn't kneel this time, and she didn't cry. She put her hand over the child's hand where it gripped the fabric and let it stay there, and across the corridor, Do-hyun, who had spent 2 years unable to make himself walk through a single door, crossed the distance and put his hand over both of theirs. She would raise these children. She would never carry one. She had stopped needing either fact to erase the other, and that, more than any letter or any hearing, was the only ending the story had ever actually been building toward.